So while all the US shenanigans are going on with Biden, with the cognitively impaired nominee for the Democratic Party and all of that, and Trump, we have this ongoing pushing closer to annihilation by the US empire toward Russia. They have these Europe 2020. It's basically a war games that they're getting about 17 different countries to participate in, and really the target of this is Russia. So that's, of course, making Russia anxious, and also it's it's kind of appalling, really. Russia isn't really doing anything to anybody, but this sort of awful, these war games are going on, and it's all about attacking Russia. But something that's sort of equally as bad, but worse you could say really, is that the US at this stage believes that it can use nuclear small yield, they call it small yield, nuclear weapons on whatever target basically hasn't submitted to it. It basically has said that it has this nuclear option to attack another country, and that being Russia. And so that means that according to Russia, they have in their sort of agreements that they don't strike preemptively. That's not something that the US agrees to. They don't have that in their agreement. They're quite they believe they have the right to strike preemptively at any country, really. But Russia does not have that intention, and so they would not strike any country preemptively, they say, but they will defend themselves, and they will use nuclear weapons to do that. So this ridiculous idea the US has that nuclear weapons are now an option for them in their wars, even when they call them low yield, and they're still devastating. And they're still nuclear weapons too. Even though the US believes that they can actually get away with that. This is how crazy they are at this point, that they can get away with using low-yield nuclear weapons, and they're installing them on these submarines, that they can use them against countries, and that this isn't going to provoke basically world annihilation, mass annihilation, because you start off with that, and then that leads to a much wider response, because Russia is not going to sit back and wait to be destroyed. And if it says that if it sees an attack against it, it will respond immediately with nuclear weapons. So this is very dangerous. And that quote, that saying, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. For the US, they've basically excluded diplomacy, and they've gotten rid of all the back routes to diplomacy with Russia, I think. Maybe not all, but from what I understand, they've cut back on, diplomacy just isn't something in their toolbox anymore, and hasn't been for a long time, because they're looking for full spectrum dominance. They're looking for a complete hegemony in the world and homogenize the world. And, that's capitalism for you. End stage capitalism is inextricably linked to imperialism, as Lenin has said. Basically, all these wars are capitalist wars. And all these soldiers are, they're just cannon fodder for capitalism. And of course, the weapons industry are always rubbing their hands together at every single sort of US attempt at a conflict. And it's continually looking for conflict. It's like an insatiable monster. The US is a rogue state. It's a rogue terrorist state. And anybody using that word terrorist, if they're not applying it to the US as well, then that is very selective, and it's kind of racist too. This is what the US is doing now. It's sort of putting these low-yield nuclear weapons on submarines. And when you have these types of low-yield, in quotes, nuclear weapons, when you have them, at some point you're going to want to use them. That's what they did with the nukes in World War II. They didn't have to use those nukes to end the war. That's a complete myth. That is not true. Japan at the time was actually preparing to surrender, but they used them anyway. And they bombed 2 cities and killed Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and they killed 100,000 plus people. And that was the reason is to try out those nuclear weapons and see what they did. That's really what that was all about. It's like when you have, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And when the US had that nuclear weapon, that's what they intended to do with it. They wanted to try it out, and so they bombed Japan without any reason to, really. And they've tried out nuclear weapons on their own soldiers. You know, they've put them in situations where they knew it was going to be very, very risky and dangerous to soldiers' health, and they did it anyway. You know, so that's the sort of moralless, a monster that has no moral center, basically, because a monster, you know, cannot have a moral center, I don't think, anyway. So, you know, it's insatiable, and and it's leading us closer and closer, you know, that the seconds to midnight or whatever. This is the kind of thing that everybody should be paying attention to. And anybody who is voted, any politician that is okay with that, and also any politician that voted for that $738 billion of military spending for Trump recently should be held accountable, because that's one of the things that Trump is using this on, to pay for these nuclear weapons. You know, this is the thing. And the Democrats, a lot of them voted, you know, for that military spending, masses of military spending. Most of those Democrats vote for everything, pretty much everything Trump wants, really. That's where we, you know, as Whitney Webb said, it's just one big party, really, the GOP and the DNC. They're just different faces of the same party, but they're pretty much the same. And it is, and you can see the way what they're doing, putting up a nominee like Joe Biden, the DNC. They don't care if they win or they don't win, because if you did care, you wouldn't be choosing Joe Biden, you would be choosing Bernie Sanders. But they choose Joe Biden even though he's completely cognitively impaired. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. I've done a number of videos, and I said I wouldn't. I said this was a departure from electoral politics, so I'll make it that. But anyway, check out this. I'm sharing some excerpts from about 3 different articles about this pressure on Russia, and also this using, you know, this idea of that you can use nuclear weapons and it not turn into a sort of Armageddon kind of thing. This is what the US thinks they can do now. So thanks for watching. So stay tuned and hear these articles. So here we have, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry, increased NATO activities near Russia's border will not make Moscow change its foreign policy. NATO members planning to perform military maneuvers near the Russian border should think about the consequences of the belligerent actions that could lead to increased tensions, the Russian Foreign Ministry said on Saturday. Quote, neither Washington nor NATO conceal the fact that the potential enemy, in quotes, in the drills is Russia. Historically, our country has been threatened with similar saber rattling. Such threats, however, were fruitless, end quote, the ministry said, adding that the hostile intentions of the US and NATO will be reciprocated by Moscow's own development of military capabilities. The comments come ahead of NATO's, quote, Defender Europe 2020, end quote, war games scheduled for April-May, which according to the Russian Foreign Ministry will become the biggest maneuver since the end of the Cold War. It was earlier revealed that 7,000 to 10,000 US troops will take part in the exercises in Poland alone, almost half the total number of US soldiers participating in these drills. Set to take place across 10 countries, Defender Europe 2020 will see the biggest deployment of US military forces to Europe in the past 25 years. The drills are expected to involve 37,000 allied troops from 18 nations, including 17 NATO members and Georgia, and last several months through July. The first drill-related movements of troops and equipment began in late February. The US blocks UN from supporting Russian-Turkish ceasefire in Syria's Idlib. US opposition reportedly blocked the UN Security Council from backing the agreement between Russia and Turkey for a ceasefire in Syria's Idlib province. US diplomats earlier sought to back Turkey's incursion in the area. Friday's meeting was requested by Russia after President Vladimir Putin and his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan hammered out a ceasefire after a 6-hour meeting in Moscow the day before. However, one of the parties, in quotes, blocked the Security Council statement that would have expressed support for the agreement, Russia envoy to UN Vasily Nebenzia said. Then we have this insanity. Starting a nuclear conflict now a political option for Washington, Moscow believes. This was on the 6th of March, 2020. These are all recent. The US is expanding its nuclear capability with types of low-yield weapons, and Moscow believes US strategists now consider launching a nuclear strike as a viable option in a conflict. The US has made adjustments to its nuclear posture and has been introducing low-yield nuclear warheads to its arsenal, including those that can be launched from submarines. Russia sees such developments with great concern, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, told journalists on Friday. The developments make Moscow believe that the American leadership, quote, has made a decision to consider a nuclear conflict as a viable political option and are creating the potential necessity for it, end quote. She rejected US justification of the upgrade by pointing the finger at Russia and called on Washington to adhere to nuclear non-proliferation and reduction goals, saying that the path of, quote, unrestricted growth of military strength, end quote, which it was pursuing was, quote, a road to a dead end, end quote. Unlike Russia, the US never made a formal agreement not to be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. Russia's nuclear doctrine says it may use nuclear weapons in response to a conventional attack that threatens the existence of Russia as a sovereign state, but otherwise the nuclear option would only be used in response to an attack with weapons of mass destruction. The title of this is Step to Nuclear Doomsday. US puts low-yield nukes on submarines to counter made-up Russian quote-unquote strategy, by Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is a former US Marine Corps intelligence officer. He served in the Soviet Union as an inspector implementing the INF Treaty in General Schwarzkopf's staff during the Gulf War, and from 1991 to 1998 as a UN weapons inspector. He's actually written a number of books, which I hope to look at some point. The US has deployed low-yield nuclear missiles on submarines, saying it's to discourage nuclear conflict with Russia. The move is based on a, quote, Russian strategy, end quote, made up in Washington and will only bring mass annihilation closer. In a statement released earlier this week, U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy John Rood announced that, quote, the U.S. Navy has fielded the W-76-2 low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile SLBM warhead, end quote. This new operational capability, Rood declared, quote, demonstrates to potential adversaries that there is no advantage to limited nuclear employment because the United States can credibly and decisively respond to any threat scenario, end quote. The threat underpinning justification for this new U.S. nuclear deterrent had its roots in testimony delivered to the House Armed Services Committee in June 2015 by U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense Robert Work, who declared that, quote, Russian military doctrine includes what some have called an, quote, escalate to de-escalate strategy, end quote, a strategy that purportedly seeks to de-escalate a conventional conflict through coercive threats, including limited nuclear rise, end quote. However, any review of actual Russian nuclear doctrine would have shown this to be a false premise. Provision 27 of the 2014 edition of, quote, Russian military doctrine, end quote, states that Russia, quote, shall reserve the right to use nuclear weapons in response to the use of nuclear weapons and other types of weapons of mass destruction against it and or its allies, as well as in the event of aggression against Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. The decision to use nuclear weapons shall be taken by the President of the Russian Federation, end quote. Despite this, the concept of, quote, escalate to de-escalate, end quote, as official Russian military doctrine has become ingrained in official U.S. nuclear doctrine by 2018 with the publication of the U.S. Defense Department's Nuclear Posture Review. Moscow, the 2018 NPR claimed, quote, threatens and exercises limited nuclear first use, suggesting a mistaken expectation that coercive nuclear threats or limited first use could paralyze the United States and NATO and thereby end a conflict or terms favorable to Russia. Some in the United States referred to this as Russia's, quote, escalate to de-escalate doctrine, end quote. In response to this, quote, made in America, end quote, Russian threat, the 2018 NPR identified a requirement to modify a number of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, with low-yield nuclear warheads to strengthen U.S. nuclear deterrence by providing U.S. military commanders with a weapon that addresses, quote, the conclusion that potential adversaries like Russia believe that employment of low-yield nuclear weapons will give them an advantage over the United States and its allies, end quote. As was the case with Robert Work's 2015 congressional testimony, the 2018 NPR did not provide the source for the existence of a Russian escalate to de-escalate doctrine, except to note that it originated in the US, not Russia. Nonetheless, based upon the 2018 NPR, President Donald Trump requested that the Defense Department require a new low-yield nuclear warhead for the Trident SLBM, setting in motion a process which culminated in the recent announcement that this new warhead had reached operational capacity. In response to President Trump's request, a letter signed by a laundry list of notable American statesmen, politicians, and military officers, including former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and the former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General James Cartwright, was sent to the Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, stating that there was no need for this new low-yield warhead. The letter furthermore noted that the premise of this warhead, the so-called escalate to de-escalate Russian doctrine, was derived from a false narrative, in quotes, combining non-existent Russian intent with an equally fictitious, quote, deterrence gap, end quote, that could only be filled by the new nuclear weapon. This letter fell on deaf ears. At a meeting of the Valdai Club in October 2018, Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed the issue of Russian nuclear doctrine, prompted by questions raised by the publication of 2018's NPR.
Невозможно. Конечно, это катастрофа всемирная. Но я повторяю, мы не можем быть инициаторами этой катастрофы, потому что у нас нет превентивного удара. Да, в этой ситуации мы как бы ждем, что в отношении нас кто-то применит ядерное оружие. Сами ничего как бы не делаем. Ну да, но тогда агрессор, он все равно должен знать, что возмездие неизбежно, что он будет уничтожен. И, ну что ж, а мы жертвы агрессии. И мы как мученики попадем в рай. А они просто сдохнут. Потому что они даже раскаяться не успеют.
Quote, there is no provision for a preemptive strike in our nuclear weapons doctrine, end quote, Putin declared. Our concept is based on a reciprocal counterstrike. There is no need to explain what this is to those who understand. As for those who do not, I would like to say it again. This means that we are prepared and will use nuclear weapons only when we know for certain that some potential aggressor is attacking Russia, our territory only when we know for certain, and this takes a few seconds to understand that Russia is being attacked. We will deliver a counterstrike. This would be a reciprocal counterstrike. Why do I say counter? Because we will counter missiles flying towards us by sending a missile in the direction of the aggressor, end quote. In 1982, article published in Foreign Affairs entitled, quote, Nuclear Weapons and the Atlantic Alliance, end quote, 4 senior American statesmen, McGeorge Bundy, George F. Kennan, Robert S. McNamara, and Gerald C. Smith, who had a hand in crafting U.S. nuclear policy, declared that, quote, no one has ever succeeded in advancing any persuasive reason to believe that any use of nuclear weapons, even on the smallest scale, could reliably be expected to remain limited, end quote. Yes. The fact holds as true today as it did when the article was written. Perhaps there is no better voice to emphasize this point than Russian President Vladimir Putin, again addressing the 2018 Valdai Conference. Quote, of course, the decision to launch nuclear weapons in defense of Russia amounts to a global catastrophe, but I would like to repeat that we cannot be the initiators of such a catastrophe because we have no provision for a preemptive strike. Yes, it looks like we are sitting on our hands and waiting until someone uses nuclear weapons against us. Well, yes, this is what it is. But then any aggressor should know that retaliation is inevitable and they will be annihilated, end quote. Quote, and we as the victims of an aggression, as martyrs, would go to paradise while they will simply perish because they won't even have time to repent their sins, end quote. The Trump administration would do well to ponder these words as they embrace the false deterrence of the new, quote, low-yield, end quote, nuclear-armed Trident SLBM. The fact of the matter is it deters nothing and only invites global annihilation.